So thank you for that very kind introduction, Michael, and I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be here and to be sharing the stage with this man, Bob Kendrick. As Michael mentioned, my name is Bill Maddox. I represent an organization in Tallahassee, Florida called the Village Square. It's a bridge building group, and we hold forums from time to time, most often at St. John's Episcopal. We have a long-standing partnership with St. John's in our community. And it is a gathering space for all kinds of conversations in our town. So I often play the role of moderator in those gatherings, and I get the great honor today of playing moderator and drawing out Bob and some of the lessons that we can learn from the Negro Leagues and from his museum. But in the course of this, I will also chime in from time to time and share experiences that we've had at the Village Square so that you can learn a little about some of the work that we do in addition to learning all about the Negro Leagues and Bob's work. So we'll try to touch all the bases here as we go. Sorry. We'll spend some time talking first about home and visitors. Then spend some time talking about signs and wonders. Also talk about wins and losses, and then conclude when we round third, come for home, talking some about perseverance and joy. But I want to begin with home and visitors, and especially home. The Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, based here in Kansas City, has a really strong connection to this city and presence in this city. I was talking with someone who lives here last night, and they were like, yeah, that museum is something that we all, as a community, kind of take pride in. And so I'm just curious, why Kansas City? Why is this museum that, in some sense, could have been put almost anywhere?
Yes.
Why Kansas City, and what is the special connection that you have with this town?
Well, I get asked that quite often, and first let me say thank you all for having me be part of your conference. Why Kansas City? Because Kansas City is the birthplace of the Negro Leagues. The leagues were formed right around the corner from where the museum currently operates, in an old building called the Paseo YMCA. That is where Andrew Rube Foster and a contingent of 8 independent black baseball team owners met in that historic landmark to establish the Negro National League, the first successful organized black baseball league. So Kansas City is fittingly and rightfully the home for a Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. But you're right, there were other cities. Pittsburgh has tremendous black baseball history, Birmingham and other places. But this was absolutely the place for there to be a Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, given the authentic roots were actually laid in that foundation right here, right around the corner. As a matter of fact, we're saving that historic landmark and converting it into an education and research center in memory of the late, great Buck O'Neil. And when Rube Foster had successfully convinced these other independent black baseball team owners, because he had to be a masterful salesman, he had to convince them that in order for black baseball to not only survive but thrive, that they needed an organized structure. And he was able to convince them to give up their independency, because they were making money with baseball. It was a little bit haphazard. And he was able to do that. And he is an absolute genius. And when he established his newly formed Negro National League, he stood there at the Paseo YMCA and boldly proclaimed, "We are the ship, all else the sea." Yeah, he was sending a message to Major League Baseball that a new player had arrived on the scene to be reckoned with.
Well, that is great. The connection that you have to Kansas City and the kind of pride that this city takes in your museum, I think reminds me a lot of something at the Village Square that I suspect that this will be true throughout our conversation, that many of the themes that you're going to hear us talking about are themes that relate to your work at local parishes, because we put a lot of emphasis. We talk at our gatherings often about universal or global or national issues, but it's all done in a local context, in a place where people can gather, where they can get to know one another. And we find that that sort of local connection is often helpful in bridging divisions when you're communicating with someone that you're looking at, across the table. It's very different than communicating with a perfect stranger in cyberspace. And so the connection that you have to this local community doesn't at all surprise me, and I'm sure is part of the success of your museum. But I want to talk about visitors now for just a minute. When I most recently visited your museum, because I try to make a practice of swinging by every time I'm in town, I saw a middle-aged white couple, middle-class looking couple kids coming out with all their Royals Kansas City gear on. And I thought, wow, this is a really interesting clientele. And I'm curious, I've heard it said that you get as many white patrons at your museum as you do African American. Is that true? And why?
It is absolutely true. And honestly, we've seen the African American participation rise over the last decade and a half. And I guess you could theorize, or I could possibly theorize, that I do think many African Americans thought that this was going to be a painful reminder of the past. And we sometimes shun away from those experiences. My white patrons, who are typically baseball fans, and they love history. And this combines the best of both worlds. I think we've done a reasonably good job over the last decade and a half of trying to help the African American community understand that this is not a sad story. It's not a somber story. No, this is a celebration. And as I remind people, the circumstances that dictated a need for a Negro Leagues, yes, those are sad and sorrowful. Segregation was a horrible chapter in this country's history. But the story that we share at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum is about what emerged out of segregation. This wonderful story of triumph and conquest. And it's all based on one small, simple principle. You won't let me play with you in the major leagues? Okay, I'll create a league of my own. And folks, when you stop to think about that, that is the American way. And so while America was trying to prevent them from sharing in the joys of its so-called national pastime, it was indeed the American spirit that allowed them to persevere and prevail. And what's not to love about that kind of story? And so as we've been able to kind of help bring this story and give it more attention and bring it to the forefront, and the work that we're doing with particularly urban school districts, that has had a tremendous impact. And we're seeing now those numbers are almost equal. But initially, it was disproportionate white to black.
So this, to me, is really interesting, because I would have imagined that there might have been greater reluctance, especially if your museum had been, let's say, the African American History Museum baseball division, maybe, or something. But the primary emphasis, I would think that there would be a lot of white people that might be reluctant to attend, fearful that this is a painful story. But one of the things that I think you've captured with the way that your museum is designed is something that we often try to do in our work at the Village Square, which is to find ways to enter into difficult conversations, sometimes through the back door instead of through the front door. African American History Museum might be a front door because you're telling history. Yes, it's baseball history, but it's more than that.
It's American history.
It's American history, and were this framed differently, I can easily imagine greater reticence on the part, but I think for many of us who are baseball fans, it's like, well, this is our game. This is a story that we can relate to, that we want to learn more about.
And what I've found, and this is to be so true, what I love about our museum is that you don't have to be a baseball fan to appreciate it. Now, of course, we certainly think that's sacrilegious, but that's okay. But if you are a fan of American history, you're going to love that museum. if you are a fan of the underdog overcoming adversity to go on to greatness, you're going to love the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. Now, if you are a baseball fan to boot, well, as we say down in the country in Georgia, you're in hog heaven. Yeah, because it combines all of those worlds. I think one of the greatest compliments that I've ever received about the museum, there was a conference in town, and a lady was in our gift shop. She had already gone through the museum experience, and I just stopped in the gift shop, and as I typically do, I started running my mouth. I asked her, how did she enjoy her experience? And you know what she said to me? She said, sir, she didn't have any idea who I was. She said, sir, I hate sports. I think sports are ridiculous, but I just spent 3 hours in your museum and I could not leave.
How about that?
That was one of the greatest testaments to what this story is really about. See, baseball is merely a premise for a far more grandiose story. For me, there are 3 key themes to take away from the story of the Negro Leagues. First, the importance of economic empowerment. Secondly, an unprecedented level of leadership that emerged in the African American community through the formation of these teams coming into those communities. And then thirdly, the social advancement of America, as Jackie Robinson is handpicked from the great Kansas City Monarchs to be the chosen one. And that surprises so many of my visitors, because I do think, Bill, that they think that Jackie just walked out of nowhere and started playing for the Brooklyn Dodgers. But his real rookie season was here in Kansas City, 1945. And as I tell my guests, while he was only here for 5 months, the 5 months he spent in Kansas City, he fell in love with everything Kansas City is famous for. Barbecue and jazz. Yeah, he liked the ribs at a place called Old Kentuck Barbecue. Old Kentuck Barbecue would become the forerunner of the great Gates barbecue chain of restaurants that are world-renowned here in Kansas City to this day. And I'm going to say that he fell deeper in love with jazz, because I do believe that Jackie was already a jazz aficionado. But as I oftentimes say, while New Orleans may lay claim to jazz, Kansas City gave jazz its soul. And 5 months later, y'all, he was gone. He had literally disappeared. And I was very blessed to know several of his 1945 Kansas City Monarch teammates. Of course, they've all passed on now. But if they were with us today, they would tell you that when Jackie joined the Kansas City Monarchs in 1945, there was absolutely no fanfare surrounding him whatsoever. He was just another ball player trying to make the great Kansas City Monarchs roster, but they knew he was different than they were. And my dear friend, the late, great John Buck O'Neill, the founder of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, he would surmise it in this fashion. He would say that we had become acclimated to segregation, but not Jackie Robinson. He was Pasadena, California. He was UCLA. So this whole Jim Crow thing didn't sit well with him whatsoever. But beyond that, that was it. And 5 months later, he was gone. He had literally disappeared. His teammates had no idea where he was. Of course, we now know that he was meeting with Branch Rickey. And the two of them would make the monumental decision that he would become the chosen one to break Major League Baseball's then 6-decade-long self-imposed color barrier. Well, we make the rather bold assertion there at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum that Jackie's breaking of the color barrier wasn't just a part of the Civil Rights Movement, that it was actually the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. This is 1947. So this predates those more noted civil rights occurrences. So this is before Brown versus the Board of Education. This is before Rosa Parks' refusal to move to the back of the bus. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as Buck would so eloquently say, was merely a sophomore at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, when Jackie signed his contract to play in the Dodgers organization. And of course, our very own President Harry S. Truman, born right up the road from where we are now, Independence, Missouri, would not integrate the armed forces until a year after Jackie. So for all intensive purposes, this is what started the ball of social progress rolling in our country. Baseball. And our country folks literally jumped on the coattail of baseball.
Yeah. No, you really can't understate just how important that event was. And I know in Tallahassee, we lay claim to Jackie as well. He was born only 15 miles from us. And so it was
Cairo, Georgia.
in Cairo, Georgia.
Not Cairo. It's spelled Cairo. It ain't Cairo, Egypt. It's Cairo, Georgia.
My middle son played a ball game at Jackie Robinson Field in Cairo, and I kid you not, the high school team there that he was playing against was called the Cairo Syrup Makers.
That's it. That's it.
So it was crazy. But we also claim in Florida, lay claim to Robinson because we would say that he played his first integrated game in Florida in '46 during spring training.
Spring training there.
In Daytona Beach, where
Absolutely.
every other town around wouldn't allow him to play, but because of the influence of Mary McLeod Bethune-Cookman College, he was able to play in Daytona,
Yeah.
and that was the first integrated game that he took part in. All right, let's talk a little about signs and wonders. This is a crowd that is used to symbolic speech and
Yes.
using metaphor and story to illustrate greater truths. You've got a very interesting design to your museum that employs chicken wire and a kind of circuitous route to the main attraction. Tell us a little bit about how you have structured your facility and how that tells the story, if you will, or helps tell the story of the Negro Leagues.
Yeah, for those who had the opportunity to participate in the dinner the other night and got a chance to walk through the museum, the centerpiece there is what we call the Field of Legends. And I'm biased, but I think it's one of the most amazing displays in any museum in the world. It features 10 life-size bronze sculptures of Negro League greats, and they are all cast in position as if they were playing a game. They represent 10 of the first group of Negro Leaguers to be inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame. So when you walk into the museum, you literally walk into an old ballpark, and the first thing you see is the field. But we segregate you from the field. We wanted our visitors, particularly my school-age audience, to at least remotely experience what segregation was like. So in the case of these tremendously talented and courageous athletes, y'all, they knew full well that they were good enough to play in the major leagues. So close to it, yet so far from it. So from most vantage points, you can see the field, but you can't get to it. And so the only way that you are allowed to take the field at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum is that you have to earn that right. And you do so by learning their story. And as Bill alluded, you look through a chicken wire backstop onto the field. And the chicken wire is symbolic in itself because it symbolizes segregation. You see, during that era, if black fans were allowed in to watch a major league game, that is oftentimes how we were separated. So black fans would sit either down the left or right field lines. We'd be separated from white fans who sat in the rest of the ballpark with a chicken wire barrier. We used that same chicken wire to separate all of our visitors from the centerpiece of our exhibition. And so as you make your way into the gallery, we wanted an inspirational passage that we thought would set the mood and tone for what our guests would encounter when they made their way into the gallery. We chose a verse taken from the Roman Catholic Bible, Ecclesiastes, that simply says, "My son, if you aspire to be a servant of the Lord, prepare yourself for testing. Set a straight course and keep to it, and do not be dismayed in the face of adversity." Folks, that was Negro Leagues baseball in a nutshell. They loved the game so much that they were willing to endure whatever social adversity confronted them as they traveled the highways and byways of this country just to play baseball. Their passion would not only change our sport, but more importantly, it would change this country for the better.
So not only do you have some really poignant signs to point patrons to larger truths, but you tell a lot of stories in the course of this museum. One of the people that I was particularly glad to see you give attention to was a 16-year-old who played for the Indianapolis Clowns, who later came to Atlanta when I was a boy, and starred for the Atlanta Braves. Tell me a little about your appreciation for Hank Aaron and how his breaking the all-time home run barrier was important, and yet how it showed that even though we had made a lot of progress, because this is the early 70s.
1974.
74, so a good 25, 27 years after Jackie Robinson.
Yes.
Nevertheless, Aaron himself encountered an awful lot of mistreatment.
Hate and vitriol.
Yeah.
1974, he got over 1 million pieces of hate mail because he was about to break this fabled white baseball player's record, a black man in the Deep South. I grew up in Crawfordville, Georgia. Crawfordville, Georgia is east of Atlanta, west of Augusta, all of 500 people. And every day on the playground, I had to be Henry Aaron. He's my all-time favorite baseball player, my childhood idol. Now, I know some other kids sometimes wanted to be Henry Aaron, but I had to be Henry Aaron. And in 1999, I get the opportunity to take my childhood idol on a tour of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And folks, it is the first and only time I've ever been starstruck. And every time I was around him, I was reduced to that almost 12-year-old kid that when he hit home run 715 in Atlanta's Fulton County Stadium, I'm at home in my mother's living room in Crawfordville, Georgia. And as he's circling the bases in Atlanta's Fulton County Stadium, I'm circling the bases right alongside him in my mother's living room. So the old couch was first base. She had an old TV that was second base. The other old couch was third base, and her recliner was home plate. And as my childhood idol was touching them all, I'm touching them all too. And there we are, face to face. Now, mind you, we've had 2 American presidents, and President Bill Clinton, President George W. Bush, First Lady Laura Bush, First Lady Michelle Obama, the late, great General Colin Powell, former Vice President Al Gore, a plethora of athletes and entertainers. And I always say this, with no disrespect to any of them, they are not Henry Aaron in the eyes, mind, and heart of this kid from Crawfordville, Georgia. And we go through. And for those who saw, there's a small section in the museum dedicated to the clown teams, because that's where he began his career in 1952 with the Indianapolis Clowns. At that time, y'all, he was a skinny, cross-handed hitting shortstop. So in the case of Mr. Aaron, he was a right-hand hitter who was hitting with his left hand on top. That is unorthodox. The fear is that you break your wrist hitting in that manner. Henry Aaron is knocking the cover off the baseball in a highly unorthodox fashion. When it gets to the Clowns, they put the right hand on top, and the rest, as they say, is history. He was shortly after discovered by the Boston Braves, who would become the Milwaukee Braves, who, of course, would become the Atlanta Braves. And, of course, he will go down in this sport as one of the game's all-time greatest players, but it all began for him in 1952 with the Indianapolis Clowns. And there's a legendary photo. It's my favorite photo in the entire exhibition of him standing at the train station in Mobile, Alabama. 1952, about to go leave home, likely for the first time, to go chase that dream. And there's a small duffel bag right by his foot. And we stopped at that photograph, and he says, "Bob, I may have had 2 changes of clothes in that bag, $1.50 in my pocket, and a ham sandwich that my mama had made me going to go chase that dream." It worked out pretty well for the Hammer.
It did. It sure did. All right, you mentioned the Clowns, and one of the things that I think is really interesting about their story is that in some ways they were kind of the baseball equivalent of the Harlem Globetrotters.
Absolutely.
In the sense that they were very skilled ball players, but nevertheless were even greater showmen or entertainers.
Yes.
And did a lot of barnstorming around, as did many other Negro Leaguers. Tell us a little about kind of the role of humor, the role of showmanship, and how that kind of plays into this story and why we should.
And the clown teams are somewhat controversial because you had two white businessmen, Sid Pollock and Abe Saperstein, who both were involved with the Harlem Globetrotters, who were promoting this. And so you'd have guys dressed up in clown attire. They would be entertaining before, during, and after games. Well, today we call them mascots. But the rest of the ball players were serious baseball players. And so if you'd have asked one of them to dress up in a clown outfit, you'd have to fight them. But because some within the African American community believe that, and I'm going to say more so in the black press, felt like the clowns were perpetuating a stereotypical depiction of African Americans, they didn't necessarily care for it. But black fans flocked to those games because you were going to be so thoroughly entertained. Some of you may remember the name Goose Tatum. Goose Tatum was a legendary basketball player for the Harlem Globetrotters. He is in the Basketball Hall of Fame in Springfield, Massachusetts. He is credited with having invented what we now know to be the hook shot. But Goose Tatum was a slick fielding first baseman for the Indianapolis Clowns. And the man had the longest arms I've ever seen on a human being. He's about 6'3", 6'4", but he had an 84-inch wingspan. And because his arms were so long and he was so long and gangly that he could walk on the field and do absolutely nothing, and people would erupt into laughter. And so the clown teams were filling up ballparks all over the country. But you know who has reincarnated the clown teams? The Savannah Bananas.
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah, they've taken it to a whole nother level.
They
But
have.
that is exactly what the Indianapolis Clowns used to do.
How about that? That's extraordinary. All right, so one of the things that Michael pointed out in the introduction that I think is really important for us to spend some time with as we kind of consider wins and losses, and there's a great deal of emphasis that is given to the integration of Major League Baseball.
Yes.
And you not only honor Jackie, but you honor many of the others that were the first to be on particular teams and whatnot, which I really just love. But there's a when you flip the coin over, yes, there is reason to celebrate the rise of all of these ball players who belonged in the major leagues, but there was a underside to this that was painful and in many ways unfortunate. Tell us a little bit about that and kind of how it played out, not just in the Negro Leagues, but in many ways throughout a lot of entrepreneurial ventures led by African Americans.
Yeah, I think when we examine the integration of baseball, there were some unintended, but probably some intended consequences that came along with it. This was progress in many ways, but there was also a lot lost with integration of baseball, which in essence, y'all, spawned integration in a more broader spectrum. And Negro Leagues Baseball was the third largest black-owned business in this country. It only trailed black-owned insurance companies who emerged during that era and would insure African Americans more than the 10 to 15 cents that the white insurance companies would insure us. Back then, they would essentially insure me just enough to bury me, 10 or 15 cent policy. Well, black-owned insurance companies came about and not only insured my livelihood, but insured my stock, insured my crop, insured my home, and as a result, made millions of dollars. Next, of course, was Madam C.J. Walker. I see a sister over there. I know she know who Madam C.J. is. But for the rest of you, if you don't know who Madam C.J. Walker, you should. Madam C.J. Walker would become this country's first self-made businesswoman millionaire of any skin color. And you know how she did it? Doing black hair. Yeah, Madam C.J. had schools of cosmetology in every major urban center in this country, becoming the first woman to earn $1 million with a business structure. Next was Negro Leagues Baseball. And again, as my dear friend Buck O'Neill would say, all you needed was a bus, 2 sets of uniforms, and you'd have 20 of the greatest athletes who ever lived. But as you made your way through the museum, you saw some symbols of black life. And that was done purposefully because we wanted you to understand how greatly black businesses were impacted by the success of black baseball. So typically, wherever you had successful black baseball, you had thriving black economies. And so you see the hotel room there, which was part of the Street Hotel. The Street Hotel was the black-owned hotel right on the corner of 18th and Paseo there in the historic 18th and Vine Jazz District. And let me tell you, it wasn't a travesty to have to stay at the Street Hotel. Because you're black and you visited Kansas City, that's where you stayed, or you got a room at the Paseo YMCA. Well, we depict what we call the sitting room of the Street Hotel. You city folks would call it the lobby. But you could walk into the sitting room of the street on any given day, and you might see sitting in one of those chairs former heavyweight boxing champion Joe Louis, or at that time the fastest man in the world, Jesse Owens, although Jesse Owens would never race the legendary Cool Papa Bell. Flat out refused to race Cool Papa. He would race horses around the bases, but never the great Negro Leaguer Cool Papa Bell. You see images of the great Lionel Hampton, the great vibraphonist. Hampton was a devout Kansas City Monarch fan, loved the Monarchs so much that Buck O'Neill would put him in a Monarch uniform. He'd sit on the bench and serve as an honorary coach. There's an image of Lena Horne shown throwing out the first pitch at a game. Cab Calloway had his own semi-pro black baseball team. So did Louis Armstrong, Satchmo. Satchmo's first love, y'all, was baseball. He wanted to be a professional baseball player. He just happened to be a better trumpeter. So he chose the right path. And I got to share this, one of my fondest memories of so many memories that I've had at the museum. I had the esteemed honor of walking the late, great General Colin Powell through the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And you got to remember, he's the general. There's a stature, very distinguished, very dignified. You could almost say an air of regalness when you were in his presence, until we got to that photograph of Louis Armstrong and his semi-pro team. And when he got to that picture, he wasn't the general anymore. He had been reduced to a kid. And he looks at me and he says, Bob, my daddy played for Louis Armstrong's semi-pro team.
How about that?
The Armstrong Secret Nine out of New Orleans, as they would say. And you see, interestingly enough, all the jazz musicians wanted to be baseball players. All the baseball players wanted to be jazz musicians. But the reason that we have these lifestyle exhibits is that we're trying to, again, help our guests understand the economic impact yielded by black baseball. It wasn't uncommon, folks, that these athletes could ride into a town, fill up the ballpark, but yet not be able to get a meal from the same fans who had just cheered them, or not have a place to stay. So yes, they would sleep on the bus and eat their peanut butter and crackers until they could get to a place that might offer them basic services. But what you have to admire about this story is they never allowed that set of social circumstances to kill their love of the game. Their spirits were such that if I've got to sleep on the bus, and if I've got to eat my peanut butter and crackers, I'm gonna keep playing ball. You can't rob me of this joy of playing baseball. Well, what they did was they brought those, as I like to define them, segregated, mandated black-owned businesses, a built-in clientele that led them to their economic heights. With the loss of the Negro Leagues, we lost that catalyst that sparked that economic commerce in many of those African-American communities, and those communities essentially died. And so the story of the Negro Leagues is a fascinatingly complicated story. There was a lot of give and take in this grand scenario.
Well, and in some ways, this reminds me of the story that you alluded to earlier about Effa Manley wanting to be compensated for Monty Irvin because she was like, hey, he's a, you know, I'm a team owner in the Negro Leagues. If he's going to go play in the major leagues, shouldn't I be compensated? And it strikes me that, yes, this was progress, the integration of baseball, but it could have been done in a different way.
Of course it could have.
We saw with the merger of the NFL and the AFL that whole teams went to play
Exactly.
in the larger league or the
Exactly.
new league. The same thing
NBA.
happened in NBA, ABA.
ABA.
Same thing happened in basketball, but unfortunately in baseball that didn't happen. And it ended up undermining, though it was great overall, and certainly for the individual players, for a lot of black-owned businesses, it was the beginning of the end.
And that's why I say unintended, but also some intended consequences, because the major league owners knew that if they siphoned this talent out of the Negro Leagues, that it was going to put the Negro Leagues out of business. And what Bill alluded to, Jackie Robinson was not Branch Rickey's first choice. His first choice was a ball player and a dear friend of mine, I miss him dearly, the late, great Monty Irvin. And Monty Irvin was a five-tool superstar in the Negro Leagues with movie star good looks. He had everything you needed. But Monty had just gotten back from World War II, 1944. He was suffering from what he would admit to be shell shock. Today, of course, we call it PTSD. But it wasn't the PTSD that prevented him from being the first. It was a woman by the name of Effa Manley. Effa Manley owned the Newark Eagles. So yes, ladies, there were women who were owners of Negro League teams. Effa Manley,
and a few players.
Hilda Bolden, Olivia Taylor, Minnie Forbes. Well before Major League Baseball opened up this opportunity, there were three pioneering women who competed with and against the men in the 1950s in the Negro Leagues: Tony Stone, Connie Morgan, and Mamie Peanut Johnson. And as I remind my guests, the Negro Leagues gave women an opportunity to do things in this country before this country gave women an opportunity to do things. But Effa Manley, to say that she couldn't stand Branch Rickey, that might be an understatement. She didn't care for Branch Rickey at all, and rightfully so, because she saw exactly what Rickey was going to do. Rickey was going to come into the Negro Leagues and essentially raid it of his star talent without any compensation to those owners. Rickey didn't think that he needed to compensate because it was in a completely different league. And she wasn't having it. And so she threatened to litigate. And Rickey, I think, understood that he could not afford a public battle with this black woman over this black ball player, because you now know that the other owners are going to stand deeper in solidarity and try and block this. So she backs off of Monty Irvin. And that's when Rickey turns his sight here to Kansas City to one Jackie Roosevelt Robinson. And folks, Rickey has been hailed as a saint. And don't get me wrong, there was certainly, I think, some righteousness to Rickey, and this was going to be a tremendously bold move to buck the system and fight against those other major league owners who didn't really like Rickey to begin with. They saw Rickey as this smart aleck, know-it-all, and you know what? He was. And he outsmarted them. And so he backs off of Monty, turns his sight to Kansas City. But here's how shrewd Rickey was. As I said, Rickey was somewhere between a saint and a devil. But then again, aren't we all? And so this is how shrewd Rickey was. I believe that Rickey was banking on the fact that the Kansas City Monarchs owner couldn't and wouldn't fight back. You know why? Because he was white. J.L. Wilkinson, who owned the Kansas City Monarchs, was a white man who made his entire living in black baseball. Folks, there is no way he can be the public face of blocking what every black person in America had been waiting for a black man to play in the major leagues. If he does, that fan base that had been so loyal to him, they would have turned their backs on him right away. And I think Rickey knew this. He had Wilkie stuck between that proverbial rock and hard place. And so publicly, Wilkie said all the right things because he's got to protect his business interests. But privately, folks, he is seething. And he's not seething because a black man's about to play in the major leagues, but this black man you're going to take away from me, you're going to put me out of business. And he was absolutely right. He sells his interest in the Kansas City Monarchs in 1948. a year after Jackie takes the field, because now the handwriting is on the wall. It wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when the Negro Leagues were going to fold. And he sells it to his business partner, T.Y. Baird. The story gets even better. I'm pitching for there to be a dramatic TV series done on the Negro Leagues, because you can't make this stuff up. It's too good. T.Y. Baird, folks, was a known Kansas City, Kansas Ku Klux Klansman who made his living in black baseball. There's got to be a TV series done on the Negro Leagues, and I sure hope they make old Bob the executive producer.
I think that'd be a great idea. All right, look, we've got time for only one more question, and I want to focus on just the sense of joy that I sense this entire baseball league played with.
Yeah.
And how, in your efforts to keep it alive, beyond just the joyful personality that you bring to the storytelling, you were telling me that there's a really interesting way that is now being used to kind of introduce young ball players, young fans to the Negro League players, and how it in some ways kind of captures this sense of joy. So tell us a little bit about that in the remaining few minutes that we have.
Yeah, no, I am so proud that we were able to get the Negro Leagues into a video game. Yeah, the video game MLB The Show, the biggest baseball video game in the world. And in 2023, we were able for the first time ever to include the Negro Leagues. But it's done in what is called a storyline mode. And so you don't really get access to the players until you learn their backstories. And folks, it has been by far the biggest thing this museum has ever done, because now millions upon millions of young people and young adults are not only learning about the Negro Leagues, but they're falling in love with the Negro Leagues because they are able to engage with them in a video game. See, there's this misnomer that our children don't care about history. They do care, but it is incumbent upon how history is presented to them. And so when we put it in a mode and medium in which they were accustomed to engaging with, the light bulb clicked. And now everyone is saying that, hey, what a great way to teach history. And to give you one quick story, final story, to give you an indication of the impact that this video game is having, shortly after it came out in 2023, I was taking a group of potential investors. We're working on an initiative to bring expansion Major League Baseball to the great city of Nashville, Tennessee. The team would be called the Nashville Stars. And it would be the first time ever that a Major League team had carried the name of a Negro Leagues team. This too will be game-changing. And so I'm taking them on a tour of the museum. We get out on the field of legends, and I go through the litany of introductions, player by player, position by position, and of course, Satchel Paige is on the mound. And so I'm telling my Satchel Paige stories, and as I typically do, Satchel is the only player in the video game that actually has names for his pitches. See, everybody else, you get fastball, curveball, changeup, slider. But Satchel Paige, folks, actually named his pitches. So he had what he called the midnight creeper. He had the two-humper. He had the bat dodger. He had the hesitation pitch. He had the long tom, the short tom, the jump ball, the trouble ball, the radio ball, the wobbly ball, the dipsy-do. And he also had a pitch that he famously called his B-ball. And as I would typically do, I would always pose to my guest, do you know why he called it the B-ball? And so when I raised the question, there was a young white kid standing on the third base line with his dad. He couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years old. Y'all, he looks at me, he raises his hand, he sticks out his chest. He said, Mr. Kendrick, I know why Satchel called it the B-ball. I say, you do? Well, tell the folks why Satchel called it the B-ball. He says, Satchel called it the B-ball because Satchel says it bees where I want it to be when I want it to be there. And I looked at him I said, man, you must have been playing the show. And his dad says, yes, he's been playing the video game, and he's been listening to the stories that I am sharing in the video game. I don't know if you caught that, but I am actually in the video game.
All right.
I saw myself doing a lot of things I never dreamt that I would be in a video game, and it has been literally a game changer.
Well, I think it's great that you guys are finding new ways to tell old stories.
Exactly.
To bring things that happened in the past forward to our day, putting them in a context that young people can appreciate and that can allow these stories to live on. I don't know about you, but I could sit here and talk to this man all day. But please join me in thanking Bob.